The late autumn wind howled against the windows of Ashworth Hall, rattling the ancient panes, as though the very manor trembled with the force of what was about to unfold within its walls. Rain lashed the stone facade in sheets, turning the manicured gardens into a blur of grey and brown, stripping the last defiant leaves from their branches and scattering them across the grounds like the remnants of some forgotten joy. Inside the grand drawing room, where portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, and the fire in the massive hearth did little to warm the suddenly frigid air, Lady Eleanor Ashworth stood with her hands clasped protectively over the swell of her abdomen, 6 months heavy with the child she had believed would bind her marriage in joy. Her pale blue gown, carefully selected that morning when the world still held promise, now felt like a mockery against her trembling form. Before her stood Lord William Ashworth, her husband of 2 years, the man whose gentle courtship had won her heart, whose laughing eyes had once looked upon her with such devotion that she had thought herself the most fortunate woman in all of England. But those eyes held no warmth now. They burned with a cold fury that turned her blood to ice, and in his hands, those hands that had once caressed her face with tenderness, he gripped several letters, their edges crumpled from the force of his rage. "Deny it if you dare," William's voice cut through the room like a blade, each word measured and precise, the very control in his tone more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Letters in your own hand, proclaiming your affection, arranging clandestine meetings with my own cousin, Richard, my blood. Did you laugh together at my ignorance, madam? Did you mock the fool who believed in your virtue?" Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet, her mind unable to comprehend the accusation, the sheer impossibility of what he claimed. "William, there must be some mistake. I have written no such letters. Richard is your cousin, nothing more. I barely know him. Please let me see them. There has been some terrible error." Her voice, steady at first, began to fracture under the weight of his unchanging expression. She reached toward him, her hand extended in supplication, but he stepped back as though her very touch would contaminate him. "Error?" The word dripped with contempt. "I have examined them myself. The handwriting is yours, unmistakable. The intimate details, the references to our private life that only you could know." He broke off, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "I trusted you. I gave you my name, my home, my heart. And this is how you repay such devotion." Eleanor's mind raced desperately through her days, searching for any interaction with Richard that could have been misconstrued. But there was nothing. Nothing but polite exchanges at family gatherings, formal pleasantries in William's presence. "I swear to you upon everything I hold sacred, upon the life of our unborn child, I am innocent of this accusation. William, please, you know me. You know I could never." But even as the words left her lips, she saw the terrible finality in his eyes, the way he looked at her as though she were already a stranger, someone he had never truly known. The tears that began to stream down her cheeks seemed only to harden his resolve, as if her grief were merely another performance, another deception in a marriage he now believed had been built entirely upon lies. "You will leave Ashworth Hall at first light," William pronounced, and the words fell upon Eleanor like a death sentence, final and absolute, severing her from everything she had known and loved in a single merciless declaration. She staggered backward, her hand reaching for the back of a chair to steady herself as the room seemed to spin around her, the faces in the portraits blurring into accusatory shadows. "William, please, I beg you think of the child, our child. Where would you have me go? I have no family, no means. You cannot cast me out in this condition, not without." But he turned away from her, his shoulders rigid beneath his coat, his hand raised to silence her pleading. "You have until dawn to gather your belongings. The cottage at the eastern edge of the estate will serve as your residence. You will be provided with basic necessities, nothing more. I will not have you starve, but neither will I endure your presence under this roof another day." The household, which had been conducting its evening duties with the usual quiet efficiency, ground to a halt as the news spread like wildfire through the servants' corridors, whispered behind hands, and met with wide eyes of disbelief. Eleanor climbed the grand staircase to her chambers, each step an agony, feeling the weight of pitying and horrified stares following her ascent, and collapsed onto her bed as Martha, her faithful maid, who had been with her since her wedding day, rushed to her side with tears streaming down her weathered face. "My lady, this cannot be happening. His lordship has gone mad. Everyone below stairs knows you are innocent of such charges. We must do something, must make him see reason." But Eleanor, her hands trembling violently as she pressed them against her swollen belly, where their child moved and kicked, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding around it, could only shake her head in numb despair. Through the long hours of that terrible night, Martha helped her pack trunks with clothing, books, and the few personal items she could call her own, though everything in this house had been provided by William's wealth, and Eleanor felt herself being systematically erased from the life she had built. Near midnight, summoning the last reserves of her strength and dignity, Eleanor sat at her writing desk and composed a letter to William, her hand shaking so badly that the ink blotted and smeared, but she persevered, pouring her heart onto the page, declaring her innocence with every fibre of her being, begging him to investigate further, to question Richard directly, to give her a chance to prove that these letters were fabrications or mistakes or anything but what he believed them to be. She sealed it with wax, pressed her signet ring into the soft seal, and asked Martha to deliver it to William's study. Martha returned within minutes, her face ashen, holding nothing, and Eleanor knew without asking what had happened. William had taken the letter, and without reading a single word, had consigned it to the flames of his study fireplace, watching her final plea turn to ash, as he had already reduced their marriage to ruins in his heart. Dawn came cold and grey, the rain having given way to a bitter wind that rattled the window panes and seemed to keen with Eleanor's unuttered sorrow. The carriage that would carry her to exile waited in the drive, a small, shabby conveyance rather than the fine coach she had arrived in as a bride, and this deliberate slight was not lost on the staff who had gathered in silent witness, many with tears on their cheeks, to watch their mistress depart in disgrace. Eleanor, wrapped in a heavy cloak that barely concealed her condition, walked through the entrance hall one final time, her eyes touching on every familiar detail, the marble floors she had crossed as a new wife, the flowers she had arranged just yesterday in crystal vases, the very air that held memories of laughter and music and hope, and then she stepped out into the cruel morning and did not look back, though she heard Martha's muffled sobs behind her, and knew that at least one soul in this place believed in her innocence, even if the only one who truly mattered had condemned her without mercy or reprieve. The cottage that became Eleanor's prison stood at the eastern edge of the Ashworth estate, a structure that had once housed the gamekeeper and his family before a larger residence had been built closer to the main house, and though it was not without its modest charms, a thatched roof, whitewashed walls, a small garden now overgrown with autumn's decay, it felt to Eleanor like the edge of the world, a place where she had been cast out from all that was familiar and beloved into a limbo of uncertainty and shame. The weeks that followed her banishment moved with the peculiar slowness of suffering, each day stretching interminably before her as she navigated the routines of survival in this diminished existence, her body growing heavier with the child, while her heart seemed to hollow out with loneliness and despair. The villagers, who had once curtsied respectfully when she passed in her carriage, now crossed to the other side of the lane when they saw her approach, their faces averted, their silence more damning than any spoken condemnation, for the scandal had spread like poison through the countryside, and in their eyes she was a fallen woman, an adulteress who had betrayed a good man and brought disgrace upon an honourable name. Martha, bless her faithful heart, came under cover of darkness twice each week, risking William's wrath and her own position to bring supplies, bread and cheese, preserves from the manor's kitchen, wool for knitting, candles to ward off the encroaching winter darkness, and these visits became the only human connection Eleanor possessed, the only moments when she could speak aloud, the thoughts that otherwise circled endlessly in her mind, like caged birds desperate for release. Eleanor spent her days in activities that kept her hands busy. Even as her mind wandered through the labyrinth of her grief, she sewed tiny garments for the baby who would soon arrive, each stitch a prayer for a future she could not imagine. She read from the small collection of books she had been permitted to bring, though the romantic novels that had once delighted her now seemed like cruel mockery, and she wrote letters to William that she knew he would never read, pouring out her innocence, her confusion, her anguish onto page after page that she then locked away in a wooden box, a record of her truth, even if no one would bear witness to it. The child within her moved with increasing vigor, little feet and fists pressing against the walls of her womb, and Eleanor would place her hands on her belly and weep for this innocent life, who would be born into shame, who would never know their father's love, who would bear the burden of a scandal they had no part in creating. And she wondered with desperate aching what William would think if he could feel these movements, if he could know the reality of the child he had helped create and then abandoned. As November gave way to December, winter descended upon the cottage with harsh winds that found every crack and crevice in the old walls, and Eleanor would huddle by the meagre fire, wrapped in shawls, watching the frost creep across the window panes like lace patterns of ice, feeling her isolation as a physical weight upon her chest, a crushing loneliness that made each breath an effort, and she thought sometimes that this must be what it felt like to be forgotten by the world, to exist in a space between life and death where nothing mattered and no one cared. And only the insistent movements of her child reminded her that she was still tethered to this earth, still responsible for at least one other soul, and so she endured, day after cold and endless day, waiting for a resolution she could not envision, and grieving for a love she feared was lost forever. William had believed that banishing Eleanor would bring him peace, that removing the source of his humiliation and betrayal from his sight would allow him to rebuild the walls around his wounded pride and resume the life he had known before. Her deception shattered it, but instead he found himself haunted by an absence that filled every corner of Ashworth Hall with ghostly reproach, her empty chair at the dining table a silent accusation, her abandoned embroidery on the drawing-room settee a reminder of all the small domestic intimacies he had destroyed with his righteous fury. He retreated to his study, that masculine sanctuary of leather and dark wood where he had spent so many evenings in her company, reading aloud while she worked at her needlework, and now he sat alone with a decanter of brandy that never seemed to empty, no matter how many glasses he poured, staring at the letters that had condemned her, reading them again and again until the words blurred before his eyes, and his head pounded with the effort of maintaining his certainty against the insidious whispers of doubt that crept into his thoughts during the long, sleepless nights. His sister Catherine arrived in mid-December, sweeping into Ashworth Hall with her usual commanding presence, and within an hour of her arrival, she had demanded to see the evidence against Eleanor, sitting across from William in that very study and examining the letters with a scholar's precision, while he defended his actions with arguments that sounded increasingly hollow even to his own ears. "These letters prove nothing beyond what someone wishes you to believe," Catherine said, her sharp eyes moving from the pages to her brother's haggard face, noting the shadows beneath his eyes, the tremor in his hands, the bottle that sat too prominently on his desk. "Eleanor has always been devoted to you. Any fool could see it, and you have cast her out in her condition based on correspondence that could have been fabricated by anyone with sufficient malice and opportunity." William wanted to rage at her and to demand she leave and take her doubts with her, but instead he found himself unable to meet her gaze, his hands clenching and unclenching as memories rose unbidden in his mind. Eleanor's face on their wedding day, radiant with joy and hope, her gentle laughter when he made some awkward attempt at humor, the way she would touch his arm in passing as if she could not bear to be near him without some small contact, her tears of happiness when she had told him about the child, and most terrible of all, her face on that final morning, pale as death itself, her eyes pleading for a mercy he had refused to grant. Catherine left the study with promises to investigate further, and William was alone again with his brandy and his letters, and the growing, gnawing fear that he had made a terrible mistake, that his pride and his rage had led him to commit an injustice so profound that it could never be undone, and at night he dreamed of Eleanor's pale face, her mouth forming words he could not hear, her hands reaching toward him across a distance that widened with each step he tried to take toward her, and he would wake gasping, his nightshirt drenched with sweat, the phantom image of her suffering imprinted on his mind like a brand that burned hotter with each passing day, and he knew, though he could not yet admit it even to himself, that whether the letters were true or false, he had destroyed something precious and irreplaceable, and the peace he had sought through banishment remained as elusive as forgiveness in the cold and empty halls of his ancestral home. Catherine Ashworth had inherited her father's methodical mind and her mother's intuition for human nature, and these qualities combined to make her a formidable investigator when she set her mind to uncovering truth, which she did now, with the fierce determination of someone who had watched her brother destroy himself and an innocent woman over evidence that felt wrong in ways she could not initially articulate, but sensed with every instinct she had possessed. She began by examining the letters again in the privacy of her chambers, this time not merely reading the content, but studying the physical documents themselves, the paper quality, the ink color, the formation of individual letters, the pressure of the pen strokes, and what she discovered made her breath catch in her throat. For while the handwriting was indeed remarkably similar to Richard's flowing script, there were subtle inconsistencies in the slant of certain letters, a slight tremor in the loops that suggested someone copying rather than writing naturally. And most damning of all, the paper stock was from a batch that had only been purchased for Ashworth Hall 6 months prior, yet the letters were supposedly written over a year ago, when Richard would have been using his own stationery from his estate in Cornwall. Armed with these observations, Catherine sent for Richard himself, summoning him to Ashworth Hall with an urgent letter that brooked no refusal, and when he arrived 3 days later, travel-worn and confused about the emergency, she sat him down in the drawing-room and questioned him with the precision of a barrister, watching his face as she described the accusations against him and Eleanor, and what she saw there was not guilt but genuine shock and outrage that anyone could believe such falsehood about him and his cousin's wife, whom he had met only twice in his life, and for whom he felt nothing but respectful familial regard. Richard's alibi was impeccable and easily verified. He had been abroad for the better part of the previous year, first in Italy studying Renaissance art, and then in Greece examining classical ruins, and he produced letters from colleagues, hotel registers, and shipping manifests that placed him thousands of miles from England during the period when the alleged affair would have taken place. His genuine correspondence to William during that time, filled with descriptions of ancient temples and Italian sunsets, innocent letters that someone had clearly used as templates to create the damning forgeries. Catherine's mind worked rapidly through the implications, and she began to consider who within the household would have both the opportunity to access Richard's genuine letters from William's desk and the motive to destroy Eleanor's marriage, and her thoughts turned inevitably to the household staff, those invisible servants who moved through the halls of Ashworth Hall, observing everything while being observed by no one, who knew the family's routines and secrets, who had access to the study when William was absent, and most particularly to Mr. Blackwood, the household secretary who managed William's correspondence, who would have seen every letter Richard sent, who would have known the paper stock and had the skill to forge a convincing hand, and who had always seemed to Catherine to watch Eleanor with an intensity that went beyond professional duty, his eyes following her movements with a hunger he thought concealed, but which Catherine had noted with the vague discomfort one feels when sensing something not quite proper. She began to observe Blackwood with new attention, noting how he paled when she asked casual questions about household correspondence, how his hands shook slightly when she mentioned Richard's return, how he found excuses to avoid being in the same room with her for any length of time, and Catherine felt the pieces of the puzzle sliding into place with a certainty that was both satisfying and horrifying, for if her suspicions proved correct, then William had destroyed his marriage and condemned his innocent wife based on the machinations of a jealous servant, a truth so terrible that it would require every ounce of her courage to pursue it to its inevitable and devastating conclusion. The snowstorm arrived on the winter solstice, howling down from the northern moors with a fury that seemed to mirror the chaos of Eleanor's own body as the first pains gripped her in the small hours before dawn, and she lay in her narrow bed in the cottage, her hands clutching the sheets as contractions rippled through her with increasing intensity, knowing with a terrible certainty that the child was coming now, tonight, in the midst of this violent tempest that had transformed the world beyond her windows into a whirling whiteness that swallowed all sound and sight. She managed to light a candle with trembling hands and stumbled to the door, hoping against hope that someone might pass by, that help might somehow reach her in this isolated place where she had been abandoned to face her greatest trial alone, and whether by providence or simple human kindness, Martha appeared through the driving snow an hour later, having felt in her bones that this would be the night, and having defied the storm to reach her mistress, her face red with cold and determination as she pushed through the door and immediately began preparing the cottage for the ordeal ahead, boiling water and gathering clean linens, while Eleanor paced the small room, her nightgown already soaked with perspiration despite the winter cold. The local midwife, Mrs. Brennan, arrived barely in time, a sturdy woman who had brought half the village children into the world and who asked no questions about scandal or shame, but simply rolled up her sleeves and took command of the situation with the calm authority of long experience. And Eleanor found herself grateful beyond words for these two women who stood by her when her own husband had cast her aside, who held her hands and spoke words of encouragement as the pains intensified to a level she had not imagined possible, her body seeming to tear itself apart as the hours crawled past and the storm raged on with undiminished fury. In her delirium, Eleanor called out for William, his name torn from her lips in moments when the pain overwhelmed all pride and pretense, and she wept not only from physical agony, but from the aching loneliness of facing this profound moment without the man who should have been beside her, who should have held her hand and whispered that she was brave, that all would be well, that he loved her and their child, and the absence of his presence was a wound as deep as any the labor inflicted on her exhausted body. Just after midnight, as the old year prepared to give way to the new, Eleanor's daughter entered the world with a cry that cut through the howling wind, like a proclamation of life's stubborn persistence in the face of all sorrow. And Mrs. Brennan placed the tiny, squalling infant on Eleanor's chest, while Martha wept openly with joy and relief, and Eleanor looked down at the small red face, the tiny fists waving in protest at this cold new world, and felt love crash over her like a wave, fierce and protective and absolute, a love that made her own suffering seem suddenly insignificant compared to the miracle of this new life she held against her heart. She named her Rose, after William's mother, that gentle woman who had died when William was barely 12 and whose portrait still hung in the great hall at Ashworth. And as Eleanor whispered the name to her daughter, she wept for all that had been lost, for the father who would never know the child who bore his mother's name, for the family that should have gathered to celebrate this birth, for the happiness that had been stolen from them by lies and pride and the terrible fragility of trust. And she held Rose close as the storm finally began to diminish outside, the wind dying to a whisper as dawn approached, and the world lay silent beneath its blanket of fresh snow, beautiful and pure and utterly indifferent to the small human drama that had unfolded in the cottage through that long and lonely night. William had not slept that night, the storm outside matching the tempest within his soul as he paced the halls of Ashworth like a ghost haunting his own life. And though he told himself he had no right to think of Eleanor now, no right to wonder about her welfare or the child she carried, his feet carried him toward the stables, as if moved by some force beyond his conscious will, and he found himself saddling his horse in the darkness, while the wind howled and snow drove against the stable walls with such fury that his groom protested the madness of riding out in such weather. But William ignored him and rode out into the blizzard, his face stung by ice and his vision obscured by the swirling whiteness, following the path toward the cottage more by instinct than sight. He did not know what drew him there on this particular night, whether some mystical connection between husband and wife that transcended his betrayal, or simply the restless guilt that had given him no peace since the moment Eleanor's carriage had disappeared down the drive months ago. But as he approached the cottage through the storm, he saw lamplight burning in the windows, warm and golden against the violence of the winter night, and then he heard it, a sound that stopped his heart in his chest, the thin, piercing cry of a newborn infant, cutting through the wind like a knife. William dismounted, his legs nearly giving way beneath him, as the full meaning of that sound penetrated his consciousness, and he stood there in the snow, frozen not by the cold but by the terrible knowledge that his child had been born, was being born, had just entered the world, and he was here, mere yards away, yet separated from that sacred moment by a chasm of his own making, a gulf of accusation and pride and wounded fury that now seemed utterly insignificant compared to the magnitude of what was happening in that small cottage where his wife labored alone, without him, without his hand to hold or his voice to encourage her through the ordeal he should have shared. He moved closer to the cottage, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, and through the window he could see shadows moving inside, the midwife's sturdy figure, Martha's smaller form, and Eleanor as his Eleanor, though he could not see her face clearly, and he heard her cry out, a sound of such pain that it tore through him like a physical wound, and he wanted to burst through the door, to go to her, to beg her forgiveness, to be there as a husband should be, but shame and the knowledge of his own unworthiness kept him rooted to the spot, a silent witness to the consequence of his blindness and his rage. The hours passed and still he stood there, watching, listening, his body growing numb with cold, while his heart burned with a mixture of grief and longing and self-loathing so intense that he wondered if this was how damnation felt, to be so close to something precious and yet forever barred from it by one's own sins. And when finally that infant's cry pierced the night again, stronger now, insistent with life, William fell to his knees in the snow and wept as he had not wept since boyhood, great wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame, for he knew with absolute certainty that he had missed something irreplaceable of a moment that would never come again, the birth of his first child, and that even if Eleanor somehow found it in her heart to forgive him, even if he spent the rest of his life trying to make amends, this particular loss could never be recovered, this absence could never be made present, this wound could never fully heal. As dawn broke and the storm finally began to subside, William watched Martha emerge from the cottage, exhausted but smiling, and he quickly mounted his horse and withdrew into the trees before she could see him, and unwilling to intrude even on the periphery of this sacred time, and he rode back to Ashworth Hall through the fresh snow, the world transformed into something clean and white and beautiful, utterly at odds with the devastation in his soul, and he knew as he rode that something had broken inside him during that long night, some final barrier of pride or self-justification, and in its place was only the raw, aching knowledge of what he had done, what he had lost, and what he might never be able to reclaim. Catherine had never trusted Mr. Blackwood entirely, for there was something in the household secretary's manner that had always struck her as obsequious yet watchful, a man who moved through the halls of Ashworth with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew where all the keys were kept and which doors might be opened without invitation. And it was this instinct that led her to his quarters on a grey morning 3 days after the snowstorm had finally cleared, ostensibly to request certain household accounts, but truly to observe him more closely in the wake of her growing suspicions about the letters that had destroyed her brother's marriage. She found his door slightly ajar, which was unusual for a man so meticulous about his privacy, and through the gap she glimpsed him kneeling before his fireplace, feeding papers into the flames with movements that betrayed a desperate haste, utterly unlike his typically measured demeanor. And without hesitation she pushed the door open fully and demanded to know what he was burning with such urgency that he had not even properly closed his door. Blackwood leapt to his feet, his face draining of color, and for a moment Catherine saw naked panic in his eyes before he attempted to compose himself, stammering something about old correspondence that was no longer needed. But Catherine had already crossed the room and seized several sheets from the desk before he could stop her, and what she saw there made her blood run cold, page after page of handwriting practice. Richard's distinctive script, copied over and over with painstaking precision, and beside these practice sheets lay several of Richard's actual letters from his travels abroad, letters that Blackwood had evidently used as templates to perfect his forgery. The confrontation that followed stripped away years of Blackwood's carefully maintained facade, and under Catherine's relentless questioning, delivered with all the imperious authority of her station, he crumbled like a wall built on sand, his confession spilling out in a torrent of self-justification and bitter resentment that revealed the depths of his obsession with Eleanor, an obsession that had begun when she was still Miss Eleanor Hartley and had come to Ashworth as a guest 2 years before her marriage. Her beauty and grace capturing the attention of everyone in the household, including the secretary, who dared to imagine himself worthy of her regard. He had written her letters, Blackwood admitted, his voice shaking with emotion, letters declaring his admiration and devotion, but she had returned them unopened, had avoided his presence with a delicacy that somehow made his humiliation more complete. And when William had begun courting her in earnest, when it became clear that the lord of the manor would claim what the secretary had foolishly dreamed might be his, something had broken inside Blackwood, some last vestige of rationality, giving way to a poisonous envy that had festered for months until he conceived his terrible plan. The forgery had been simple enough for a man with access to Richard's correspondence and the skill to mimic handwriting that came from years of copying his master's hand on documents and letters, and Blackwood had crafted his false evidence with meticulous care, weaving in enough authentic detail to make the letters convincing, while adding the poison of invented intimacy and confession that would destroy Eleanor's reputation and marriage, and he had planted them where William would find them. Knowing his master's pride and jealous temperament well enough to predict that he would react with fury rather than investigation, that he would believe the evidence of ink and paper over the protestations of the wife who had wounded Blackwood's vanity by preferring another. Catherine listened to this confession with mounting horror and rage, and when Blackwood finished, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She told him in a voice of ice that he would repeat every word to William immediately, that his malice had destroyed an innocent woman and torn apart a family, and that whatever mercy he might have hoped for had been forfeited by the magnitude of his crime. And she summoned footmen to ensure he could not flee while she went to fetch her brother, knowing that the revelation she was about to deliver would shatter William, even as it freed Eleanor from the false condemnation that had defined these terrible months of separation and sorrow. William was in the library when Catherine arrived, her face grave with purpose, and before he could rise from his chair, she told him in a voice that permitted no argument that he must come with her immediately to the drawing-room, where a matter of utmost urgency awaited his attention, and though he began to protest, something in her expression silenced him, and he followed her down the corridor with a growing sense of dread that intensified. When he entered the drawing-room, to find Blackwood standing between two footmen, the secretary's face ashen and his hands trembling, and on the table before them lay the damning evidence, the practice sheets, the genuine letters from Richard, and several of the forged pages that Catherine had rescued from the flames. Catherine presented the facts with cold precision, her voice steady as she recounted Blackwood's confession, and as the full truth unfolded before him, William felt the world tilt and shift beneath his feet, for here was proof absolute that Eleanor had been innocent, that the letters he had believed with such certainty were nothing more than the twisted creation of a jealous man's obsession, and he turned to Blackwood with such fury rising in his chest that the footman stepped forward instinctively to restrain him. But William's rage, though terrible, was eclipsed almost immediately by something far worse, a grief so profound and all-consuming that it drove him to his knees as surely as a physical blow. He demanded that Blackwood explain himself, to speak the words aloud in his own voice, and the secretary did so in a halting confession that laid bare years of unrequited desire and resentment, his voice growing stronger as he tried to justify his actions by claiming that Eleanor had humiliated him by rejecting his advances, that she had deserved to suffer as he had suffered, and it was this final statement that broke through William's paralysis, and he surged to his feet and struck Blackwood across the face with such force that the man fell backward, and William stood over him and said in a voice shaking with barely controlled violence that Blackwood would be turned over to the magistrate immediately, that he would face the full consequences of his crimes. But even as he spoke these words, William knew that no punishment inflicted on Blackwood could undo the damage that had been done, could restore the months of Eleanor's suffering, or return to him the moment of his daughter's birth that he had missed. Catherine ordered the footman to take Blackwood away and lock him in the cellar until the magistrate could be summoned, and when they were alone, William collapsed into a chair and buried his face in his hands, and his sister stood beside him in silence for a long moment before placing her hand on his shoulder and telling him gently that he must go to Eleanor now, that he must tell her the truth and beg her forgiveness. But William shook his head and said in a voice raw with anguish that he had no right to ask forgiveness, that he had condemned an innocent woman, had cast her out while she carried his child, had left her to suffer alone through pregnancy and childbirth, because he had been too proud and too quick to believe the worst, too ready to let wounded vanity override every instinct of love and trust. And how could such a transgression ever be forgiven? How could Eleanor ever look upon him again without remembering the cruelty of his accusation and the absoluteness of his rejection? Catherine knelt before her brother and took his hands in hers and told him that he could not know whether Eleanor would forgive him unless he had the courage to seek that forgiveness, and that remaining in his guilt and despair was itself a kind of cowardice, an indulgence of his own pain rather than a genuine attempt at redemption. And her words struck him like cold water, shocking him into clarity, and he realized that she was right, that whatever Eleanor's answer might be, he owed her the truth and his complete and abject apology, not for his own sake but for hers, so that she might know beyond any doubt that she had been innocent all along, that the fault had been entirely his, and that if she chose never to see him again, he would accept that judgment as just and deserved. William left Ashworth Hall within the hour, riding through the cold afternoon with a desperation that made him heedless of the icy wind cutting through his coat, and he arrived at the cottage as the winter sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, and he dismounted with trembling hands and approached the door where he had not stood since the day he had watched from the darkness during the storm. Too cowardly then to announce himself, too lost in his own torment to offer comfort when Eleanor had needed it most. He knocked, and the sound seemed to echo in the stillness, and after a moment he heard movement within, light footsteps approaching, and then Martha's voice asking who was there, and when he identified himself, the silence that followed was so complete and terrible that he thought perhaps she had simply walked away. But then she opened the door just wide enough for him to see her face, stern and protective, and she told him in a voice devoid of warmth that her mistress was not receiving visitors, that Lady Eleanor had been through quite enough without being subjected to further distress, and William began to speak, then, the words tumbling out in a rush as he tried to explain about Blackwood and the forgery and the horrible mistake he had made, and Martha's expression shifted from hostility to shock and then to something harder to define. But still she shook her head and said that Eleanor needed time, that the truth might set her free from false accusation, but it could not erase months of suffering and abandonment, and William fell to his knees there on the doorstep and begged Martha to at least tell Eleanor that he knew the truth now, that she had been innocent all along, that he was sorry beyond any words he possessed, and he stayed there kneeling in the snow until Martha finally closed the door, not unkindly but firmly, leaving him alone in the gathering dusk. Inside the cottage, Eleanor stood with her back pressed against the wall, Rose clutched to her chest, and she had heard every word William had spoken through the thin door. They had heard the raw anguish in his voice and the truth of Blackwood's betrayal, and she wept silently as she listened to her husband begging for an audience she could not yet grant, for though her mind understood that he had been deceived, and her heart still held love for him, buried beneath layers of hurt and betrayal, she was not ready to face him, not ready to risk opening herself to more pain when she had only just begun to find some fragile equilibrium in this small cottage with her daughter and her grief. William rode back to Ashworth Hall that night, but he returned the next morning with an armload of firewood, which he stacked carefully beside the cottage door, and he came again the following day with provisions, bread and cheese and preserved fruits, fine things from the manor's larder, and each day he came with something needed or useful, and each day he left a letter on the doorstep, letters that grew longer and more desperate as he poured out his remorse and his dawning understanding of what he had done, how completely he had failed the woman who had deserved only his trust and protection. And though Eleanor did not open the door to him, she watched sometimes from the window as he worked, splitting wood or clearing snow from the path, performing the humble tasks of service and penance, and Martha, who went back and forth between the cottage and the hall, told Eleanor that William was destroyed by guilt and grief, that he barely ate or slept, that he spoke of nothing but his need to make amends somehow, though he knew amends might be impossible, and Eleanor listened to these reports with a heart divided between the desire to maintain her protective walls and the slow erosion of her anger in the face of his evident and genuine devastation. And at night she looked at the unopened letters piling up on her table and wondered whether reading them would bring healing or only reopen wounds that had barely begun to scar, whether the truth that had come too late could ever truly set either of them free. 7 days passed in this manner, with William's daily visits and his letters accumulating on Eleanor's table like fallen leaves, and on the 8th morning Eleanor woke before dawn to find Rose sleeping peacefully in her cradle, and the silence of the cottage pressing against her like a physical weight, and she rose and lit a candle and stood before the stack of unopened letters, her hand hovering over them as she had done a dozen times before, but this time something had shifted within her, some small crack in the armor she had built around her heart, and she picked up the first letter with trembling fingers and broke the seal and began to read. William's words were raw and unguarded, stripped of all the formal eloquence that had characterized their earlier correspondence, and he wrote of Blackwood's confession and the evidence Catherine had discovered, explained in careful detail how the forgery had been accomplished, and his own terrible blindness in accepting the letters as truth, but more than the facts he wrote of his devastation at what he had done, how he had lain awake every night since learning the truth and relived the moment of his accusation, the cruelty of his words, the absoluteness of his rejection, and he confessed that he had no right to ask for forgiveness, but that she deserved to know she had been innocent all along, that the fault had been entirely his, that he would carry the weight of his mistake for the remainder of his days, regardless of whether she ever chose to see him again. Eleanor read through tears that blurred the words on the page, and when she finished the first letter, she picked up the second and then the third, and she read through the morning as Rose slept, and the winter sun climbed slowly into a pale sky, and with each letter she felt something loosening inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that William's suffering was genuine and profound, that he understood the magnitude of his transgression, and was not seeking to excuse or diminish it, but simply to acknowledge the truth and accept whatever judgment she might render. When Martha arrived mid-morning with supplies, she found Eleanor sitting at the table surrounded by opened letters, her eyes red from weeping, and Martha asked gently if her mistress was well. And Eleanor nodded and said in a voice barely above a whisper that she wanted Martha to tell Lord William something, that she wanted him to know the child's name. And Martha's face softened with understanding, and she promised she would relay the message that very day. William was splitting wood behind the cottage when Martha approached him, and he straightened immediately and asked if Eleanor had read the letters, if there was any response. And Martha told him that Lady Eleanor wished him to know that their daughter had been named Rose, after his late mother, and the effect of these words on William was immediate and complete. He dropped the axe and sank to his knees in the snow, and wept with such force that his whole body shook. For in that single gesture he understood that Eleanor had not forgotten him during her exile, that even in her darkest hours she had thought of him and honored his family, and he realized that the woman he had wronged so terribly had still found room in her heart to offer this small kindness, this connection between their daughter and the grandmother who would never know her. And Martha stood watching him cry and felt her own eyes fill with tears, for she had served both of them and loved them both, and she had hoped against hope that somehow the pieces of this shattered marriage might be gathered up and made whole again, though she knew that such healing would require time and patience and a kind of courage that neither Eleanor nor William might possess. And yet, in this moment, seeing William broken and humbled and genuinely transformed by his grief and remorse, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps redemption was not impossible after all. 3 weeks passed before Eleanor finally sent word through Martha that she would see William, though the conditions she set were precise and protective. He might come to the cottage at midday when the light was strongest, and he might look upon his daughter, but he would remain outside while she stood at the window with Rose in her arms, the glass between them, a transparent barrier that spoke volumes about the fragility of this first concession. And William agreed immediately to these terms, grateful for even this small mercy, and he arrived at the appointed hour dressed with more care than he had shown in months, his hands shaking as he approached the cottage and saw Eleanor's silhouette behind the wavy glass of the window. And when she stepped closer, and he could see her clearly for the first time since that terrible morning of accusation, he was struck by how she had changed, her face thinner and marked by suffering, her eyes holding a wariness that had never been there before. But she was still beautiful, still the woman he had loved and betrayed. And then she shifted the bundle in her arms and turned it toward the window, and William saw his daughter. Rose was sleeping, her tiny face peaceful and perfect, with delicate features that seemed almost translucent in the winter light. And even through the distortion of the glass, William could see the resemblance to his mother, the same shape of the eyes, the same curve of the mouth, and the recognition of this inheritance that spanned generations made his throat tighten with emotion. For here was proof of continuity and connection, his mother's legacy living on in this child he had never held. And he raised his hand and placed it flat against the cold glass, as if he might somehow touch them through this barrier. And Eleanor watched his face as he gazed at Rose, saw the naked longing and love and grief that played across his features, and something shifted inside her, some small weakening of the walls she had built, for she could see that his anguish was genuine and his love for their daughter immediate and unconditional. And she found herself studying him as he stood there with his hand pressed to the window, this man who had been her husband and her destroyer. and she saw that he was broken in ways that might never fully heal, that the weight of his mistake had changed him fundamentally, and after several long minutes, during which neither of them spoke, but simply looked at each other across the barrier of glass and hurt and time, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself, and she called out to him in a voice that carried through the window, asking if he would like to stay. And when he looked at her with confusion and desperate hope, she explained that if he wished he might sit on the porch while she sat inside by the window, that they need not speak if he preferred, but that he might remain there in proximity to his daughter, and William accepted this offer with such profound gratitude that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, and so began a new pattern in their strange and careful dance toward something that might, with time and patience, become reconciliation. For William settled himself on the cold wooden boards of the porch, and Eleanor positioned herself in the chair by the window, with Rose sleeping in her lap, and they sat this way for an hour or more, saying nothing but sharing the space and the silence and the presence of the child who bound them together, whether they wished it or not. And when William finally rose to leave, he thanked Eleanor with a formality that seemed almost absurd given their history, and she nodded in acknowledgement. And after he had gone, she realized that her heart was beating rapidly and her hands were trembling, for she had taken the first small step toward letting him back into her life, and she did not know whether this was courage or foolishness, whether it would lead to healing or only to fresh wounds. But she knew that she could not keep him away forever, not when Rose deserved to know her father, and so she resolved to continue these careful meetings and see where they might lead. The days began to settle into a rhythm that was both strange and strangely comforting, with William arriving each afternoon as the winter sun reached its pale zenith and taking his place on the cottage porch, while Eleanor positioned herself by the window with Rose, and at first they maintained the silence that had characterized their initial meetings. But gradually, William began to speak, his voice low and careful as he told her about the happenings at Ashworth Hall, how the gardens were preparing for spring, and the tenants had inquired after her health, and Eleanor listened without responding, but she listened nonetheless. And as the weeks passed, William's monologues grew more personal and revealing, for he spoke of his childhood in those very halls, how his father had been a distant and exacting man who valued duty above all else, and how William had learned early to suppress emotion and rely on reason, and he confessed that this upbringing had made him vulnerable to Blackwood's deception, for he had trusted the evidence of letters over the evidence of Eleanor's character. He had chosen cold logic over the warmth of faith in the woman he had married, and Eleanor heard in these confessions a man trying to understand his own failures, not to excuse them, but to trace their roots, and she found herself softening slightly toward him, even as she maintained her protective distance. One afternoon in early March, when the first hints of spring were touching the frozen landscape, and Rose was playing on a blanket near the window, making the delightful burbling sounds that infants make when they discover their own voices, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself, and she rose from her chair and crossed to the door and opened it just slightly, perhaps 6 inches, enough that the sound of Rose's laughter could flow freely through the gap to where William sat on the porch, and she watched through the window as he turned toward that sound, with such longing and joy on his face that tears immediately sprang to his eyes, and he sat very still as if afraid that any movement might cause Eleanor to close the door again. And he listened to his daughter's happy sounds with an expression of such profound gratitude that Eleanor felt something crack inside the protective shell she had built around her heart. For she realized that this man before her was not the cold and certain judge who had banished her, but rather someone broken and remade by his own mistakes, someone who had learned through terrible suffering the difference between the appearance of righteousness and its reality, and she began to see that perhaps genuine repentance was not merely words or gestures, but this kind of fundamental transformation, this willingness to sit day after day in the cold and accept whatever small mercies she might offer without demanding more. And when William finally spoke that day, his voice was thick with emotion, and he thanked her for this gift of hearing Rose's laughter, and Eleanor found herself responding for the first time in weeks, saying quietly that Rose deserved to know her father's voice, and though the door remained only slightly ajar and the distance between them remained vast, something had shifted in that moment, some acknowledgement that they were moving, however slowly, towards something that might eventually become reconciliation. Spring arrived with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic after the harshness of winter, bringing with it the scent of earth awakening and the sight of early crocuses pushing through the thawing ground. And on a morning in late April, when the air was soft and the sunlight held genuine warmth for the first time in months, Eleanor made a decision that had been forming slowly in her heart over the preceding weeks of careful observation and tentative thawing. And when William arrived for his customary afternoon visit, she did not position herself by the window as had become their ritual, but instead she opened the door fully and stood in the doorway with Rose on her hip, and she spoke the words that would change everything between them, inviting him to come inside, to sit with them properly. And William stood frozen on the porch for a long moment, as if he could not quite believe what he had heard. And when he finally moved forward, his steps were hesitant and reverent, as though he were entering a sacred space where he had no right to tread. And Eleanor gestured to the chair across from her own beside the fireplace, and they sat facing each other with Rose, now sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's arms, and for several minutes neither spoke, both seeming to recognize the significance of this moment, this crossing of a threshold that had stood between them for so many months. William was the first to break the silence, and his voice when he spoke was careful and measured, for he began to explain, not to justify but to illuminate, describing those terrible days after he had received the forged letters, how his world had seemed to shatter, how every happy memory had been recast in a darker light, how he had felt betrayed, not just in his marriage, but in his very judgment of human character. And he admitted that his response had been not only cruel but cowardly, that he had acted from wounded pride as much as wounded love, that he had wanted to hurt Eleanor as he felt hurt, without pausing to consider that the evidence might be false or his conclusions hasty. And Eleanor listened to this confession without interrupting, and when he fell silent, she began to speak her own truth, describing the loneliness of her exile, the fear that had gripped her during those final months of pregnancy, when she wondered if she would survive the birth, and what would become of her child if she did not, the profound grief of bringing Rose into the world without the man she loved beside her. And she spoke of how his accusation had not only wounded her but changed her, made her question her own worth and judgment, made her wonder if she had ever truly known him at all. And as she spoke, William's face reflected the full weight of what his actions had cost them both, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair as if he needed something solid to hold on to. And when Eleanor finished speaking, the room was heavy with shared sorrow and the accumulated pain of separation. Then William said something that surprised Eleanor with its wisdom and humility, for he told her that he was not asking for her forgiveness, that he knew he had no right to ask for such a gift, but that he was asking instead for the opportunity to prove himself worthy of it someday, that he wanted to earn back her trust through patient demonstration rather than through words or appeals to their past, and this acknowledgement that forgiveness could not be demanded or rushed, but must be freely given when and if it came, moved Eleanor deeply, and she found herself studying his face in the firelight, and seeing there not the harsh judge who had condemned her, but a man humbled and transformed by his own failures. And they talked through the afternoon and into the evening, speaking with an honesty that they had never quite achieved even in the early days of their marriage, for they had both been changed by suffering into people capable of deeper truth. And when night had fully fallen, and Rose had woken and been fed and settled again, Eleanor realized that something fundamental had shifted between them, that the door she had opened was not merely physical but emotional, and that while the path to full reconciliation would be long and uncertain, they had taken the first real steps upon it together. The morning came soft and golden, with May sunlight streaming through the cottage windows and the birds singing in the hedgerows as if the world itself was celebrating the tentative peace that had been established between Eleanor and William. And when he arrived that day, Eleanor was waiting with a decision that had formed during the long hours of the previous night when she had lain awake, listening to Rose's gentle breathing and thinking about the conversation William had shared, about the honesty and vulnerability they had finally achieved after so many months of pain and separation. And when William stepped through the door, she saw the mixture of hope and uncertainty in his eyes, the way he had learned to temper his expectations and accept whatever small mercies she might offer. And she realized that this careful humility, this willingness to receive rather than demand, was itself a kind of proof of his transformation. And so she spoke words that would change everything between them, telling him that she thought it was time he met his daughter properly, time he held Rose in his arms as a father should, and William stood very still as if he could not quite comprehend what she was offering, and Eleanor saw his hands begin to tremble even before he moved toward where she stood with Rose on her hip, and the child, now 5 months old and beginning to take notice of the world around her, looked at this man who had visited daily, but whom she had never touched with her wide, dark eyes that were so like Eleanor's own. And William approached slowly, reverently, his movements careful, as if he were approaching something infinitely precious and fragile. And when Eleanor transferred the warm weight of their daughter into his arms, she saw tears begin to fall unchecked down his face, and his whole body seemed to shake with the intensity of the emotion that overwhelmed him as he looked down at Rose's tiny, perfect features, the delicate curve of her cheek, and the small hands that reached up instinctively toward his face. And Rose studied her father with that peculiar intensity that infants sometimes have, as if she were memorizing every detail of him, and then she made one of those burbling sounds of contentment that babies make, and William broke completely, his shoulders shaking with sobs as he cradled her against his chest, one large hand supporting her head with infinite gentleness, while the other held her small body secure, and he whispered brokenly that he was sorry, so desperately sorry for all the time he had missed, for not being there when she was born, for not protecting her mother when he should have, for failing them both so completely. And Eleanor watched this moment of meeting between father and daughter and felt something fundamental shift inside her own heart. For she saw in William's face not just remorse, but a love so overwhelming and pure that it seemed to transform him, and she recognized in that expression the man she had married, the man she had believed him to be before the terrible accusations. But she also saw someone deeper and more real, someone who had been broken by his own mistakes and rebuilt into something more capable of genuine love, because he now understood its cost. And almost without thinking, Eleanor stepped forward and placed her hand on William's shoulder, the first time she had touched him since that awful day when he had condemned her, and the touch was brief and tentative, but it was there, an acknowledgement that they were, perhaps, no longer two separate people maintaining careful distance, but beginning to become again what they had once been, a family. And William looked up at her with such hope and gratitude in his tear-stained face that Eleanor had to look away, and they stood there in the simple cottage, the three of them, with the morning light washing over them like a benediction, and the future stretching before them uncertain but no longer quite so bleak. In the days that followed that profound moment when William first held Rose, a rhythm began to establish itself, tentative and careful like the first notes of a melody being composed, and during one of their quiet conversations, William spoke with characteristic directness about what he hoped might come next, suggesting that perhaps Eleanor and Rose might return to Ashworth Hall, that the three of them might resume their life together as a family in the grand manor where their marriage had begun. But Eleanor felt her entire body tense at the suggestion, for she was not ready to return to those halls where she had been condemned and cast out, where every room held memories of her humiliation and every corridor might whisper of her disgrace, and she told William with gentle but absolute firmness that she could not yet face that return, that the cottage had become her sanctuary, and she needed more time before she could even contemplate leaving it. And William, to his credit, did not press or argue but instead asked a different question, wondering if he might be permitted to help with the cottage maintenance and to visit more regularly, to make himself useful in whatever way Eleanor would allow. And this more modest proposal felt manageable to Eleanor, felt like something she could accept without surrendering the autonomy and safety she had built for herself during the long months of exile. And so she agreed, and from that day forward, William's presence became woven into the fabric of their daily life, in ways both practical and profound. For he arrived each morning with his tools and his willingness, repairing the sagging gate and the loose shingles on the roof, chopping wood for the winter stores, even though summer was barely beginning, mending the fence that kept the small kitchen garden safe from wandering deer, and between these tasks he would play with Rose, dangling his watch chain for her to grasp, or making silly faces that drew peals of delighted laughter from her, and Eleanor would watch from the doorway or the window and see in these interactions a kind of courtship. For William was courting not only his daughter's affection, but his wife's trust, proving through accumulated small actions what words alone could never demonstrate. And he brought Eleanor gifts that showed he remembered who she was beneath the pain, bringing her books of poetry because he recalled her love of verse, bringing her the first strawberries from the Ashworth gardens because she had once mentioned they were her favorite, bringing her wildflowers gathered from the fields because she had always preferred them to hothouse blooms. And in the evenings he would read aloud to her while she sewed or nursed Rose, his voice filling the cottage with stories of far-off places and impossible adventures. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, but then with gathering momentum, Eleanor began to feel something shift inside herself, began to recognize that the walls she had built around her heart for protection were perhaps no longer necessary, that the man before her had indeed changed and had been humbled and refined by his own terrible mistakes into someone capable of the patience and devotion that true love required. And she found herself watching him with Rose and feeling not just appreciation, but something warmer, something that reminded her of how she had felt in the early days of their marriage when everything had seemed possible and their future had stretched before them, bright with promise. And though she was not yet ready to speak these feelings aloud, she knew that William's persistent, gentle presence was rebuilding, not just the physical structures of the cottage, but the foundation of trust upon which their marriage might someday stand again. Summer arrived in earnest, bringing with it long golden evenings, when the light seemed to linger forever, and the air was sweet with the scent of honeysuckle and wild roses. And on one such evening in late June, when Rose was nearly 8 months old and growing more active and curious with each passing day, Eleanor and William were in the cottage garden, watching their daughter explore the world from her blanket on the grass, reaching for butterflies and laughing at the way the leaves moved in the gentle breeze. And William had been telling Eleanor about his plans for expanding the tenant cottages on the estate, seeking her opinion as he had begun to do more and more frequently, valuing her thoughts and perspective in a way he had failed to do during their first marriage. And Eleanor was responding with genuine interest when suddenly Rose pulled herself up, using the edge of the blanket, wobbling precariously on her small legs with a look of fierce determination on her face, and both parents fell silent, watching their daughter with held breath. And then Rose let go of the blanket and took one lurching step forward, then another and another, moving toward William with her arms outstretched and her face alight with triumph. And William dropped to his knees with tears already streaming down his face and opened his arms to catch her. And when Rose tumbled into his embrace, both parents were crying and laughing simultaneously, overwhelmed by the beautiful ordinariness of this milestone that so many parents witnessed together, but which they had feared they might never share. And William held Rose close and looked up at Eleanor with such joy and such sorrow mingled together that Eleanor felt something break open inside her chest, some final barrier she had been maintaining around her heart, and she realized in that crystalline moment of shared happiness that she had forgiven him, truly and completely forgiven him, that the weight of resentment and hurt she had been carrying had somehow dissolved in the accumulated days of his patient devotion and genuine transformation. And when William had settled Rose back on the blanket to practice her new skill, Eleanor asked if he might walk with her for a moment, and they moved to the edge of the garden where the roses grew wild against the stone wall. And there, in the fading light, Eleanor told him that she believed in his remorse, that she could see his love was real and his repentance genuine. And William went very still and then asked in a voice barely above a whisper whether she thought she might someday be able to love him again, whether there was any hope that they might rebuild what he had so carelessly destroyed. And Eleanor looked at this man who had been both her greatest love and her deepest pain, who had condemned her unjustly, but who had also spent months proving his devotion through actions rather than words. And she told him the truth that had been growing in her heart without her quite realizing it, that she had never stopped loving him, even when she hated what he had done, that the love had been buried beneath layers of hurt and betrayal, but it had never died. And now, in the light of his transformation and her own healing, she could feel it stirring again, tender and new, but undeniably there. And William wept openly and asked if he might embrace her, and Eleanor stepped into his arms for the first time since before the accusations. And they stood there in the garden with their daughter playing nearby, and the evening light turning everything to gold, holding each other while the past began finally to release its grip on the present. The decision to return to Ashworth Hall was not made lightly or quickly, but rather emerged gradually over the course of several weeks following that transformative evening in the garden, and Eleanor found herself thinking about the manor, not with the dread and revulsion she had felt for so long, but with a cautious willingness to reclaim what had been stolen from her. And when she finally told William one August morning that she was ready to come home, that she wanted Rose to grow up in the house that was her birthright, and for them to truly be a family again, William wept with gratitude and immediately began making arrangements, and the day of their return was set for late September, when the weather would be fine, and Eleanor would have time to prepare herself emotionally for crossing that threshold again. And when the day arrived, William came to collect them in the carriage, helping Eleanor and Rose inside with such tender care as though they were made of the finest porcelain. And as they travelled the familiar road from the cottage to the main house, Eleanor felt her heart beating rapidly, with anxiety and anticipation mingled together, and Rose, now confidently walking and chattering in her baby language, seemed to sense something significant was happening and clutched her mother's hand tightly. And when the carriage pulled up before the great entrance of Ashworth Hall, the entire household staff was assembled outside in their finest livery. And as William helped Eleanor down from the carriage, they burst into spontaneous applause and cheers, and Eleanor saw tears on many faces, including those of the housekeeper, Mrs. Hartford, and the butler, Mr. Green, who had both served the family for decades, and Martha rushed forward to embrace Eleanor with undisguised joy. And then Catherine appeared at the top of the steps looking radiant and emotional, and she descended quickly to gather Eleanor into a warm embrace, whispering that she had prayed for this day, and that Eleanor belonged here as the true lady of Ashworth Hall, and Eleanor felt the kindness of these people who had never truly believed the lies about her washing over her like a benediction, and with William on one side and Catherine on the other, she walked through the great doors and into the entrance hall, where everything was exactly as she remembered, yet somehow transformed by the knowledge that she was returning not in shame but in triumph. And William led her upstairs to their private chambers, and when he opened the door, Eleanor gasped in surprise, for he had had everything redecorated in soft shades of cream and rose and gold, removing every piece of furniture and every painting that had been there during those terrible days of accusation, and replacing them with new things that held no painful memories. And there was a beautiful nursery adjoining the main bedroom, with a cradle carved from cherry wood and walls painted with delicate flowers and butterflies, and Eleanor turned to William with tears streaming down her face, and thanked him for understanding that she needed this space to be new, to be untainted by the past. And that night, after Rose had been settled in her new cradle, Eleanor and William lay in the great bed that had been brought in specially for their return, with Rose sleeping peacefully between them in her smaller cradle positioned so they could both see her, and Eleanor looked around at the soft candlelight playing on the new walls and felt something she had not felt since before everything fell apart. She felt safe. She felt home. She felt that perhaps the future they had once dreamed of might still be possible after all. The winter months following their return to Ashworth Hall passed in a gentle rhythm of healing and rediscovery, as Eleanor and William learned again how to be husband and wife, not in the naive way of their first marriage, but with a deeper understanding forged through suffering and redemption. And as spring approached and the anniversary of their original wedding drew near, William came to Eleanor one evening when she was reading by the fire and asked with characteristic hesitation whether she might consider renewing their vows, not as a mere formality, but as a true choosing of one another, with full knowledge of all they had endured and overcome. And Eleanor looked up from her book with tears already forming in her eyes, because she had been thinking the same thing, feeling that they needed some ceremony to mark this new beginning and to sanctify what they were building together. And so it was arranged that on the first day of May, they would gather in the small chapel on the estate grounds, with only their closest loved ones present to witness them, pledge themselves to one another again, and the weeks of preparation were filled with quiet anticipation, as Eleanor commissioned a simple gown of cream silk without the elaborate ornamentation of her first wedding dress, something that spoke to the quiet strength she had gained rather than the innocence she had lost. And William worked with the vicar to craft new vows that would acknowledge the journey they had travelled and the commitment they were making, with eyes wide open to human frailty and the possibility of failure. And when the day arrived, it was perfect in its simplicity, with the chapel decorated only with wildflowers that Catherine had gathered from the fields, and Rose, now 13 months old and walking confidently, and had been given a small basket of flower petals to carry, though she was more interested in eating them than scattering them. And as Eleanor entered the chapel on Catherine's arm, since her own father had passed years before, she saw William waiting at the altar with tears already streaming down his face, and the small gathering of servants and family who had stood by them through everything rose to their feet, and when Eleanor reached William's side, he took her hands in his, and they were both trembling, and the vicar began the ceremony. But it was their own words that mattered most, and William spoke first, his voice breaking as he acknowledged the terrible wrong he had done her, and the grace she had shown in allowing him to prove himself worthy of her love again, and he vowed before God and these witnesses that he would spend every remaining day of his life honoring her, protecting her, and choosing to trust her even when fear whispered lies. And Eleanor responded with her own vows, speaking of forgiveness not as forgetting but as a deliberate choice to release the past and build something new, and she promised to be patient with his healing as he had been patient with hers. To remember that they were both imperfect people, committed to loving each other through and despite their flaws, and when they exchanged new rings that William had commissioned, simple bands of gold engraved with the date of this second wedding rather than their first, there was not a dry eye in the chapel, and little Rose, sensing something important was happening, toddled forward and wrapped her small arms around both her parents' legs, and the gathered witnesses laughed through their tears as William scooped up his daughter while keeping one arm around Eleanor, and the vicar pronounced them husband and wife again, bound not by naive promises but by tested commitment. And when William kissed Eleanor, it was with a reverence and gratitude that spoke of hard-won joy, and afterward they walked from the chapel into the spring sunshine, as a family truly united for the first time, not because the past had been erased, but because they had chosen to walk forward into the future together, carrying their scars but no longer defined by them. 5 years had passed since that May morning when Eleanor and William renewed their vows in the small chapel, and in those years the Ashworth family had flourished in ways that once seemed impossible during those dark months of separation and anguish. And Eleanor stood now in the morning room of Ashworth Hall, watching through the window as William chased Rose and her younger siblings through the garden. Rose, at 6 years old, running with the confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and security. Her brother Thomas, aged 3, following as quickly as his small legs could carry him, and baby Margaret just beginning to toddle, held carefully in her father's arms, and the sound of their laughter drifted through the open window like music, and Eleanor felt a contentment so profound it sometimes brought tears to her eyes, not tears of sorrow but of gratitude for the grace that had brought them to this place, and she thought of the cottage where she had endured those lonely months of exile, which William had transformed at her request into a family retreat where they spent quiet weekends away from the grandeur of the main house, a place that honored her suffering while no longer being defined by it, and she remembered the woman she had been when she first arrived there, broken and abandoned and carrying a child whose father had rejected them both, and she marveled at how that woman had found strength she never knew she possessed, had survived when survival seemed impossible, had learned that she could stand alone even as she hoped desperately not to have to, and William too had been transformed, the arrogant certainty that had led him to condemn her, without proper evidence, replaced by a humility and gentleness that made him a better husband, a better father, a better man than he had been before. And their marriage now was built not on the romantic idealism of youth, but on the tested foundation of forgiveness, freely given, and trust painstakingly rebuilt, and they both carried scars from those terrible months, but the scars no longer defined them, instead serving as reminders of how far they had come and how precious was the love they had fought to reclaim. And watching William now with their children, seeing the joy on his face unmarred by the guilt that had haunted him for so long, Eleanor knew that they had achieved something rare and precious. They had taken the broken pieces of their shattered lives and built something stronger and more beautiful than what had existed before. And as Rose caught sight of her mother in the window and waved with uninhibited delight, Eleanor waved back and felt her heart overflow with love for this family that had been tested by fire and emerged refined rather than destroyed. And she knew that the story of their suffering and redemption would echo through the generations of Ashworths to come, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of second chances when met with genuine repentance and patient love. And, dear listener, may this tale remind you that we are all capable of terrible mistakes born of fear and pride, that a moment's rashness can shatter lives and destroy what is most precious. But may it also remind you that no mistake is beyond the reach of forgiveness when true remorse meets true grace, that redemption is possible even in our darkest hours, if we have the courage to face what we have done and the humility to accept the gift of another chance. And may you be slow to judge and quick to verify. May you choose trust over suspicion and love over fear. And when you yourself stand in need of forgiveness or are called to offer it, may you remember William and Eleanor and know that broken things can be made whole again, perhaps not as they were before, but as something even stronger for having been broken and mended. And may your nights be peaceful and your heart be light, knowing that love persists even through the longest winters, and that spring always comes again to those who wait with hope. And this story comes to you from Tales of Heart and Home, where we believe that every ending can become a new beginning if we choose love over bitterness and forgiveness over resentment. So until we meet again in another tale, may grace and peace accompany you on your journey.